Myron's breath came in sharp, ragged pulls as she stumbled along the narrow forest path, her limbs shaking beneath a weight far heavier than the worn pack slung over her shoulder. Branches caught at her, thick, dark curls, streaked with ash-grey like frost, lingering in shadows, and the faint scar tracing her left cheekbone burned, raw and aching from the cold air nipping at her skin. Each step she took scraped her boots against tangled roots and loose stones, but still she pressed onward, her deep amber eyes flickering with a desperate resolve. The accusation that chased her was a poison clawing at her mind. Betrayal, false and cruel, had shattered the life she once knew, branded a traitor, cast from the place she called home, hunted by voices that whispered death in the night. Now, without shelter, without allies, only the fading litany of hope burnished her resolve to survive. Her head, the forest thinned, the heavy canopy parting to reveal a bleak, battered skyline. The crumbling walls of an ancient kingdom stared back at her like the hollow eye sockets of a skull. Stone towers that once roared in glory now leaned and cracked under the weight of time's neglect, their banners torn and faded into ghosts of colour. This was the border of Riven's kingdom, cold, forsaken, ruled by a man whose name struck fear into many hearts. The Alpha King. Mayon's mind faltered at the thought. The stories she'd heard in whispered conversations, tales carried away on wind. Riven was ruthless, unyielding, merciless. His icy grey eyes were said to cut through men's souls, exposing every secret, every lie, but she had no choice. No other refuge existed beyond the tangled woods and jagged peaks. He might be her jailer, or worse, but he was the only chance she had to step out from the shadow of death and live another day. Her heart pounded in her throat as she crossed the meagre boundary marker, a crudely carved stone barely visible among the moss and dying grass. The air grew colder here, heavier, saturated with the scent of damp stone and aged timber. The silence pressed down, broken only by the distant clang of a bell and the faint murmur of guards on their rounds. Somewhere, high above, the wind picked at the tattered banners, sending them flapping like wounded wings. From the castle's towering battlements, Riven watched, his raven black hair, streaked with a lone strand of silver, slipped across his forehead as he leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Each breath he drew seemed to draw coldness into the air itself. His broad shoulders shifted beneath the weight of his dark leather armor, carved with the faded sigil of a wolf. The jagged birthmark above his right eyebrow twisted subtly with the hint of a scowl. The woman in the clearing moved with purpose, though exhaustion marked every step. She did not belong here. Yet here she was, tearing through his borders as if the very walls would not hold her back. The Alpha King's beast stirred within him, a primal growl rattling his chest, deep and low, a warning unease, a question unanswered. He had expected invaders, rebels perhaps, or stray mercenaries drawn by the kingdom's weakening defences. Not a single solitary woman, cast out and blooded, yet unbowed. Who dares trespass? Riven's voice was a cold blade, carried on the wind as his shadow slipped along the battlements, like night itself, made flesh. But she did not flinch. Even as the wolves in the courtyard barked warnings, freezing at the strange scent she bore, Myron lifted her chin, amber eyes meeting his through the veil of distance, steady, unrepentant. His beast roared beneath his ribs, dark and furious, impatient with the silence. Riven's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, but the thought of capturing her sparked a flicker of something unexpected. She was no ordinary trespasser. Hours later, shackled and bruised, Myron was dragged inside the fortress walls. The great iron gates groaned, closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the stone corridors. The air inside was thick with the musk of damp stone and stale smoke, punctuated by the sharp clang of chains and the dull murmur of guards, exchanging wary glances. The fortress lived and breathed like an ancient beast, hungry for secrets the years had buried. Riven stood beside her cell, his expression unreadable, the silver streak in his hair, a stark contrast against the prison's gloom. The guards left them, alone, silent sentinels, in a forgotten realm. She met his icy steel-grey gaze, holding his scrutiny, without bowing. In that cold exchange a war waged between his power and her defiance, between captivity and rebellion. "You will answer for your crimes," he said, voice low, a command and a challenge spun into one. "Until then, you remain within these walls." She swallowed hard, the burn of humiliation fierce, but tempered by an unyielding flame within. "I have no crimes," she said quietly, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "And yet, here you are." His lips curved, just slightly, a threat or a promise. She couldn't tell. The forge of their fates was lit here, in shadows and silence. Neither king nor prisoner could yet see how tightly their lives would entwine. Days passed like moons slipping through the night, slow and relentless. Myron's world contracted to stone corridors, and the damp, cold cell where she tended her wounds in solitude. But the beast in the castle roamed beyond her walls, a pack of wolves, injured and fading, brought from the wilds, some for protection, others as allegories of the kingdom's slow death. She moved through the dimly lit kennels with quiet grace, her hands steady as she cleaned wounds and applied salves wrought from local herbs. The scent of pine resin and wild mint clung to her fingers as she spoke softly to the creatures, her voice a balm even to those who could not understand the language of humans. The wolves' eyes, sharp, wary, haunted, watched her with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They had seen strength and weakness in this fortress, but Mienne was different. She did not command with the fierceness of a predator. She offered something else, quiet healing, patience, endurance. In this cage of stone and whispered threats, she found a thread of purpose. One night, as the cold pressed through the cracks in the walls and shadows stretched like dark rivers, the silent rhythm inside the kennels shifted. The great alpha, the behemoth, who ruled the pack with jaws and fury, approached. His black fur gleamed under flickering torchlight, eyes like molten steel, fixed cautiously on her. She froze, muscles tense but unbroken, meeting his gaze without fear. The wolf moved with measured steps, nostrils flaring as scenting the strange yet familiar. His growl was low, a vibration that thrummed in the cage's stony floor. "Easy," Mayan murmured, voice soft but firm. She reached out slowly, palm open, and still. The beast hesitated, the line between predator and healer trembling like a thin thread in the wind. The pack's usual rigid hierarchy wavered in that momentile ice, and instinct melting into something fragile and unpredictable. Riven emerged then, silent as a shadow at her side, watching the interaction with a mix of irritation and reluctant fascination. His presence was a weight in the room, a reminder of power, long wrestled with and rarely lost. "What are you doing?" he demanded quietly, voice sharp, eyes narrowing. Myron did not turn to him. "Healing a broken wolf," she said simply. "The pack needs their alpha strong. We both know what happens if he falls." The king's gaze flicked between them, the great beast and the woman who moved through the darkness untouched by fear or trembling. A flicker of something, almost like respect, passed through his cold eyes, though his lips pressed into a hard line. "Careful," he warned, voice thick with unspoken threats and the grim knowledge of his kingdom's decay. Weakness is a luxury we cannot afford. She met his glance, defiance simmering beneath her exhaustion. Riffin, maybe you should remember that. Silence stretched, taut and electric. The beast growled again, lower this time, almost a rumble of acceptance. His heavy body pressed closer, dark eyes, wary but no longer hostile. Myron's hand hovered inches from his thick fur, a breath away from bridging the gulf between wild and tame. And somewhere between shadow and stone, king and prisoner, wolf and healer, a fragile connection began to take root, a tenuous spark flickering against the gathering darkness. For the first time since her arrival, Mierin did not feel quite so alone. The kingdom outside might be dying, and the king might rule with ice and iron, but here, within these crumbling walls, something new was stirring. Something neither of them expected, a slow-burning fire that could consume or transform depending on who wielded it. And as the night deepened, as wolves settled into uneasy peace, and the cold walls whispered of secrets buried too long, Mierin sat quietly in the very shadow of the Alpha King, while his beast stayed ever at her side. The castle was never truly silent, not even in its deepest hours, yet tonight the echoes that drifted through the stone corridors were darker, sharper, like the whisper of serpents poised behind every breath, ready to strike. The court murmured, poison, threading through each comment, curling in the space between noblemen and courtiers, slicing like knives cloaked in polite smiles. They spoke her name, Mierin, with thinly veiled venom, a lethal cocktail of fear and contempt. Exile, traitor, witch, words, wrapped in abandon and accusation, hurled from gilded mouths thick with suspicion and loathing. In the shattered heart of this decaying kingdom, where loyalty had grown brittle and trust was a forgotten currency, Mierin stood as a puzzle none could solve, a shadow none could tame. She was the woman cast out, yet here she lingered, like a stubborn wound beneath the king's iron rule, whispered about but never fully seen. That was the only truth the court could cling to. They saw only the exile, never the heart beneath the scars, never the quiet fire she guarded. The kitchens were cold, but alive with the hearth's low crackle, embers murmuring secrets no one else dared voice. Mierin moved among pots and wooden tables, spilling with the remnants of the day's meagre feasts, the scent of drying herbs and roasting root vegetables, wrapping around her like a muted cloak. The chill of stone walls seeped through her threadbare shawl, but the kitchen held shelter in the simple warmth of heat and work, in the steady rhythm of mundane tasks that demanded only focus, not judgment. Beneath the heavy wooden table, 2 restless pups had curled into a small, ragged pile of tangled fur and soft, whining hope. They looked up at her, shyly when she knelt, nostrils twitching, eyes round and curious, reflections of innocence caught in a world that had none to spare. More joined them, drawn by the quiet pulse of her calm, the subtle reassurance of her voice. Softly, without hesitation, Mierin began to hum, her voice low and steady, carrying the melody of an old lullaby she had learned as a child. It was a song of distant forests and safe shadows, a heritage forgotten by the walls that confined her, but vivid within the folds of memory. Her lips parted, breath steady and sure, weaving a fragile thread of comfort through the cold air. Hush now, sleep will find you soon, under moon's light, beneath the rune. The pups settled closer, their restlessness folding into gentle presses against her knees and hands. Their bodies flattened into the floor, eyes fluttering shut, like delicate petals after rain. Each trembling breath spoke of fear forgotten, momentarily held at bay by the cadence of her voice, by the fragile warmth of this solitary sanctuary. One pup, smaller than the rest, trembled against her fingers, a soft whimper curling in its throat, like a question too raw for words. Myron's hand moved slowly over its head, tracing the rough start of fur with tender patience. The scar on her cheek tingled, a faint familiar ache, maybe a reminder that kindness was sometimes the sharpest defiance a traitor could wield. Across the room, something heavy shifted. Riven's beast, the shadow lurking at the edge of this fragile piece, watched. The silence between them was a gulf threaded with tension. The great black wolf's amber eyes glinted faintly, alert and calculating, muscles taut beneath sinewed fur. He was a sentinel, hungering for trust that didn't come easy. And yet, as Myron's humming wove through the quiet air, his growl softened into a muted rumble, a reluctant acceptance that fell like a secret pact between predator and prey. Riven himself was absent from the kitchen's warmth, his presence a stoic guard stationed in the chilly hallways beyond, his hands clenched and released at his sides, a physical manifestation of the storm broiling inside him. His icy gaze flicked inward, haunted by shadows darker than the castle's walls. He resented this moment, this fragile thread weaving between Myron and his beast, a tether he neither understood nor wished to acknowledge. The court's poisonous whispers echoed inside his head, a chorus demanding loyalty, a purity he was supposed to uphold. And yet, the woman, the outlaw, sitting quietly where none dared, held pieces of his fractured soul he couldn't shred no matter how hard he tried. Traitor! His voice was a hiss cast into the cold stone as he finally stepped away from the shadows, eyes burning with a mix of suspicion and something else, something raw and unspoken. But the beast at his side remained still, ears alert, watching Mian with a wary patience that neither king nor council could command. The kitchen held its breath, the fragile peace suspended between what had been. Outside, the walls of the dying kingdom whispered of secrets buried under ash and dust, while inside, a slow, stubborn flame flickered, quiet and trembling, but alive. *********. A harsh, discordant sound ripped through the halls, a clash of steel, a cry for battle. The alarm was raised abruptly, voices sharp with panic and command echoing down stone corridors that had known too much despair already. Myron's heart slammed against her ribs as instinct surged, the quiet magic within her, flaring unbidden and fierce. She rose swiftly, eyes scanning the dim hallways coursing with flickering torchlight, nerves taut as wire. The pup stirred uneasily, cries lost amid the rising chaos, and without hesitation, she scooped the smallest one into her arms, warmth radiating through its trembling frame. The castle had become a cage, yes, but tonight that cage was under siege, and no one beyond the king or his cursed consort knew how to stand when the shadows came hunting. Riven burst into the kitchen, moments later, his presence overwhelming a tidal force of raw power barely restrained behind his narrow steel-grey eyes and broad commanding frame. The jagged birthmark above his right eyebrow twisted in a grimace as he caught the tense quiver of Myron's muscles. The pup cradled against her chest. "What are you doing?" His voice was a low growl, thick with suspicion fouled by duty and threat. Yet, beneath the edge lurked something jagged, frayed strands of protectiveness torn raw and desperately held in place. "I'm keeping him safe," Myron said, voice steady despite the storm thrumming inside her. "They don't belong in a fight." Her amber eyes locked with his, a silent challenge bleeding through the chaos. The weight of her words carried unexpected authority, a declaration she might be weaker in title but not in will. Riven's beast growled sharply, muscles rippling beneath midnight fur, as if mirroring the surge of primal anger that flared within the Alpha King himself. His gaze flicked between Mayan and the pup, this small, fragile creature who bore no part of the treachery swirling around them, whose life was as innocent and precious as the dawn they both wished to reclaim. "Step back," Riven demanded, though the command was rough with conflicted need. His body moved instinctively, seeking to place himself between the danger and the pup, yet something tethered him, an invisible thread pulling him toward the woman at the heart of this upheaval. Myron's hand curled protectively around the pup's small frame. "No, I won't let them die because of politics, or fear not again." For a moment, the world stilled. The threat beyond the castle walls seemed distant in that charged silence, where king and exile stood inches apart, neither yielding ground nor will. The attack came swift and brutal. A violent surge of shadow wraiths scaled the outer walls, their claws skidding over ancient stone, their howls tearing through the night like a curse. The castle trembled beneath the assault, stones shedding dust, and the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke and fear. Riven's hand brushed cold against Miran's arm, an unexpected touch that anchored her amidst the tempest. "Stay behind me." "No." Her reply was fierce, unwavering, fire surfacing beneath the quiet defiance. "We face it together." His eyes darkened, a storm blazing in their icy depths. "You don't understand the danger," she whispered. "I've been hunted long before I stepped inside these walls." The beast snarled in agreement, teeth bared, muscles coiled to strike, yet reluctant to leave her side. In that moment, something shifted beneath Riven's armor of command and ember, of something ancient and wild, stirred in the depths of his soul, sparked by the sight of Mayen shielding the vulnerable pup with a courage that defied his every expectation. Protectiveness flared, not just for the pup, but for the exile who refused to bow. "Then fight," he said, voice rough with grudging respect and something darker. "But don't falter." "If you fall, I won't," Myron said, eyes blazing like molten gold, "because I'm not alone." Together, king and prisoner, beast and healer, moved toward the gathering storm, the chill air thick with the promise of violence and survival. The fragile peace shattered into shards of fire and shadow, but beneath it all, something fierce and unyielding pulsed, a bond forged not of trust, but of necessity, of shared defiance against the darkness closing in. Riven's icy gaze flicked once more to Mien, then to the pup cradled safely at her breast. In that glance, unspoken and raw, was a vow, threaded with anger, protectiveness, and something like hope. The Alpha King might live in shadows, but tonight, beneath the shattered sky, the beast would fight to keep his unlikely quarry safe, and beneath the moon's bitter light, a slow-burning fire roared to life, wild, desperate, and untamed. The dawn seeped through the fractured windows of the ancient keep, casting thin shafts of pale gold across the grey stone floor. The cavernous space where the wolves gathered throbbed with the slow pulse of raw energy, itches and growls, heavy breaths and shifting weight. Mian moved quietly among the pack, her steps barely stirring dust. She traced a path familiar yet strange, her presence strange yet accepted, as if carried on the scent of old magic, half forgotten by all but the oldest seers of the realm. No one, beyond the relic of whispered counsel, knew the secret binding her to the beast blood that pulsed under the hardened shell of the kingdom's current ruler. Immunity to Riven's dominance, that unyielding, masterful will that bent cities and men alike before it, was no mere accident. It was lineage, ancient and veiled beneath layers of time, and it stirred now, a slow ember, licking at the edges of forgotten truth. She did not speak of it. No song nor story had ever tattooed itself across her lips or dreams. All she knew was the silent recognition when a wolf lunged, teeth bared at her presence and instantly melted back into cautious watchfulness. There was a moment, fleeting and fragile, when the alpha wolves circled her with wary eyes, then lowered their snarls to murmurs, then to soft whines. The shift was a slow, uncoiling, like a sunrise breath into the night. She knelt beside a wounded female, its flank torn and raw beneath matted fur. The animal's amber eyes flickered with pain and trust all at once, and Mirren gently pressed her palm against the damp, trembling flank. Heat radiated from her hand, not just warmth, but a subtle force threading through her fingertips, a balm of unseen light that seeped into ragged flesh, knitting torn sinews and quieting the wild ache of agony. Around her, the pack stilled, the air growing denser, grounding. From the shadowed doorway, Riven watched, his arms folded over the expanse of his broad chest, the jagged birthmark above his right eyebrow paling slightly in the stifled dimness. His icy steel-grey eyes narrowed, intrigued, guarded. It was a look seldom shared with any soul, fierce, unbroken, and conflicted. Why was she immune? Why could she heal these creatures whose bodies throbbed with the fierce echoes of his own beast's torment? She sat in his kingdom like a flame flickering, gentle but untouchable, bending neither to his command nor the frigid gravity of his will. Even now, watching her silent ministrations, his fury at her defiance softened under the touch of something unspoken. "Mirren," he muttered, voice rough as gravel kicked up by the wind, "they've tried to tear you apart. Yet you move among them like nothing has broken." She looked up, eyes steady and deep as riverbed shadows. "Because I am not broken," she said softly. "These wounds, they are not just flesh and fur. Pain ties them to the past, but healing frees them. Your touch," he whispered, unconsciously lowering his tone, "it calms the savage." She gave nothing but a faint tilt of her head, returning to the wolf, whose breaths came shallow and quick. The pack around them seemed to pulse with a changed rhythm. Mayenne was no longer the interloper, the exile caught in the brittle web of a dying kingdom's cruel machinations. She was the quiet hearth amid storming winds, the shrinking center of a power that roiled beneath the surface of bone and blood. Riven shifted, a rare uncertainty flickering just beneath the iron glaze of his gaze. He longed to step forward, to test the boundaries between them, to speak the ancient words binding king to beast, alpha to subject, but something in her, something wild and unreachable, halted the sharp edge of his command. Instead, he chose to watch, a sentinel, cloaked in shadow and restraint. His jaw clenched quietly, the ghost of a question lingering like smoke across a battlefield. "What are you, Mirren?" he wondered, voice rough with a newly minted hunger for answers, for truth, for the fragile bond flickering between their worlds. Pound the throne room was a cavern of frost and whispers. Cold stone walls loomed overhead, echoing with the clink of armored boots and the dry rustle of silk. Here the game of power was played, with venom-tipped words and smiles as sharp as a blade's edge. Myron sat rigid, the heavy weight of the council's scrutiny settling around her like a mantle spun from ice. The nobles gathered, stooped and sleek, their eyes shuttered with disdain, their smiles cruel as they took in the presence of the woman cast out, yet claimed by the shadow of the Alpha King himself. Her deep, amber eyes swept the room, calm yet unyielding, betraying neither fear nor bitterness. She leaned into the quiet strength carved from years of exile, each breath a testament to survival, each heartbeat a rebellion against the chains of her past. "Your Majesty," hissed Lord Varen, his voice silk resting on a knife's edge, "to what do we owe the insult of this presence in our council chambers?" Heads nodded subtly, the masked contempt threading through murmurs like black ice. Myron's throat tightened, but her gaze remained unbroken. She said nothing. That was her defiance, stillness, unshaken by their poison-tipped disdain. At her side, a low rumble vibrated through the cold air. Riven's beast, a formidable shadow, coiled at her feet. Its black fur gleamed with the sheen of midnight, muscles taut, keen eyes molten with warning. It growled low, a dark promise forged in the trenches of battle, baring teeth at any who dared wrench their gaze toward her too long, who stepped too close to what the Alpha had claimed. The nobles flinched, recalculating their barbs in the face of that primal, unyielding loyalty. Riven's presence was a silent storm in the room. His imposing figure filled the space beside the ancient throne, broad shoulders pinned under the weight of unseen wars and unspoken truths. His gaze was a steel trap, flickering occasionally, not to the council, but to Miran. Within that gaze was a venomous protectiveness that grew sharper with each passing moment, tempered by something softer, almost hesitant, concealed beneath the frosted mask he wore like armor. Behind the veneer of cold authority, cracks spidered through his carefully constructed walls. He hated the vulnerability that Mien stirred in him, hated the way she unsettled the very foundation of his control. Yet he could not, would not, deny that the shadows between them were no longer a battleground, but a fragile bridge. He caught her eye for an instant, that bright fire inside hers, burning steady as steel, and felt the tether tight beneath his ribs, a silent vow, a binding. Neither crown nor command could sever. You will remain. Riven's voice cut through the murmuring, cold and absolute. The room still trembled with unease. "My king," whispered Lady Meredith, her voice a venomous purr. "Does this mean we now govern under the shadow of an exile? A woman whose allegiance is as foreign as her origins?" Miran's eyes did not give her the gift of reply. Instead, the beast at her side growled again, low and unmistakably hungry for confrontation. Riven's fist clenched, nails digging into leather gauntlets. "Silence," he commanded, voice cutting through the chamber like a blade through silk. The nobles bowed their heads, subdued for now. And beneath the frostbitten glances and barbed words, a slow fire kindled in the spaces between Miran and Riven, one tempered by survival, stoked by necessity, and burning with a fragile hope. Hound that night, when the court had dissolved into the restless murmurs of plotting nobles and forgotten ghosts, Riven found himself once again standing near the hovel where Miran had taken refuge within the keep's darkest wing. The moon hung low and bitter in the sky, casting icy shards through shattered windows, pooling silver over cracked stone. She was there, alone, her silhouette, a quiet defiance against the chill. The wolf stirred beside her, eyes gleaming molten gold as it shifted closer, faithful and watchful. Riven stepped from shadow, voice low and raw. "Why do you stay so silent in the council?" Your voice could cut deeper than their words. Miran's amber eyes flickered to his, cool and steady. "Because here, silence is armor. And words are weapons they wield to wound, not to heal." He studied the faint scar etched along her left cheekbone, each line, a story of battles fought and lost, each mark, a testament to resilience. "Your immunity," he said, hesitant, "it's not just defiance. It's power, old blood secrets, buried in the bones of this kingdom. Do you not want to own it? To wield it?" Her answer was a breath, a whisper like wind through dead leaves. "I do not seek power for power's sake. I seek freedom from chains forged long before I was cast out." Riven felt a brittle hope flare in his chest, a fragile ribbon threading its way through the storm of his soul. "Then fight with me. Wear the crown beside me, not as prisoner or pawn, but as queen." She tilted her head, amber eyes flickering with that molten fire once more. "I will fight, but not for your kingdom. Only for myself. The beast growled softly at her feet, a bird vow in the night. Ben, we fight together, Riven said, voice fierce and certain. In that broken moonlit embrace of shadow and flame, two souls bound by impossibility found their fragile alliance strengthening, a slow burning fire kindling toward something wild, desperate, and untamed. The kingdom might crumble around them, and the past might claw like a beast in the dark, but here, between exile and king, beast and healer, something fierce and unyielding pulsed. Something neither of them had dared to name, but both already knew. Hope. The revelation was a blade that cut deeper than any wound Mirren had borne. The moon hung low, spilled silver across cold stone walls, and in that fragile light, the secret unravelled, a thread pulled loose from a tapestry long concealed. Mirren, cast out, branded a traitor and a monster, carried in her veins the blood of a rival clan, a lineage whispered about in shadowed halls, whispered still in frightened corners of the court. They said those bloodlines had been extinguished generations ago, that their power was a mere legend, a ghost story meant to scare children into obedience. Yet here she stood, flesh and bone and fire, a living testament to the threat the crown feared most. She had always sensed a weight beneath her skin, an ember smouldering beneath the surface of her defiance and scars. Now the truth poured over her like acid rain, burning through the fragile truce she'd formed with herself. She was heir, not to her assumed exile, but to a legacy that could crumble kingdoms. Riven's words echoed still, but now fractured by the knowledge clawing its way to the surface. "You're the blood they warned me about," Riven said, his voice low, the steel beneath it cracked with unspoken fear. Not anger, not accusation. Fear. My advisors. They would see you as a threat to everything we've built. Forged in fire and blood, they will not hesitate to break you. To break me through? You. Mirren met him, her amber gaze steady, the faint scar bright beneath the weight of unspoken history. I will not be their weapon, nor their pawn. Then, what will you be? His voice trembled, betraying the steel mask he wore. Silence. Her answer came crisp and clear, a decision etched into the core of her defiant soul. I choose silence over conquest, shadows over crowns. I will not beg for mercy, nor will I offer it. Her words settled between them, like the chill breath of a coming winter. Riven's storm of thoughts churned beneath his ribs, a tempest he refused to release. Losing her now, losing her before trust could root and grow, felt like drowning in a sea of nightmares, suffocating and endless. His mind twisted in agonizing loops, haunted by visions of her slipping away, whether by court intrigue or the cruel weight of her inherited legacy. He reached out, a silent plea to bridge the widening chasm, but Mirren stepped back. No resentment, no triumph, just the cold clarity of survival. Her truth was a fortress she refused to lower, and he, in that moment, recognized the depth of the battle. Either of them would have to fight alone. The court, with all its veiled daggers and whispered betrayals, would come for her, and Riven King, Alpha, Beast, would have to root himself in something stronger than fear if he hoped to hold her at all. Morning broke with tentative light, spilling through the cracked windows of the royal kennels, a place where even the coldest heart softened beneath the breath of wolves, their fur bristling with silent stories. Mirren moved among them with unspoken reverence, a quiet presence in the midst of howling echoes and restless shadows. These were the wolves the pack had cast aside, the wounded, the wayward, the forgotten pups, scurrying with eyes too bright or too dim to be accepted. Here, among these discarded souls, Mirren found something fragile and raw, that echoed her own fracture. Her hands, calloused and steady, grazed the ragged fur of an old alpha, too broken to lead, a creature whose growl was now little more than a rasp. She whispered to him, her voice soft, a balm to clawed spirits. "You're not alone." It was not promise, not hope. It was acknowledgement. To be seen, to be recognized, was sometimes the first step toward healing. The pups circled her feet, wary and curious, noses twitching as they sniffed the scent of a woman who smelled like both storm and sanctuary. One small pup, patched with scars and two large ears, nuzzled at her boot. She crouched, amber eyes locking with his, fierce, untamed, desperate for belonging. She brushed her fingers through his wiry fur, warmth spreading through the simple act. In that moment, beneath the vast shadows of shattered loyalties and looming threats, Mirren found a rhythm with the wolves rejected by the pack, the wounds both physical and spiritual, much like her own. She tended to broken limbs, cleaned festering sores with salves brewed from herbs only. She knew to gather from the wild, whispered names the wolves had forgotten they bore. To them, she became a healer, not just of flesh, but of the fractured spirit, mending not with grandeur or proclamation, but with quiet acts of reverence. Unseen, the heavy footfalls of Riven approached, his gaze drawn to her with the gravity of 1,000 unspoken questions. The beast within him lowed, a deep, guttural growl that trembled in the air, primal and hungry, not of hunger for flesh, but for connection, protection, for something he feared might forever slip through his grasp. He watched her from the shadows, every movement a brushstroke on the canvas of a fragile piece growing between her and those who had been cast aside as she herself had once been. Jealousy, a chill spark in his chest, twisted in reluctant acknowledgement. It was not the heat of romance or wild desire, but something colder, fiercer, the cold king's jealousy of the pack, lavishing their trust on her, of the wolves leaning into her quiet power when he, the alpha, had been met with cautious suspicion. It wasn't just the bond she forged with the beasts, it was the ease, the natural grace of her acceptance. In places he could only coerce. He stepped forward, then, the gravel grinding beneath his boots, soft yet deliberate. The wolves lifted heads, ears twitching, growling low as the dominant shadow of the king registered alongside the healer. Yet Mirren didn't flinch. Awful to her gaze met Riven's with that molten fire still burning brightly, and a silent assurance passed between them that here, in this liminal space between man and beast, they would find not control, but something closer to trust. Riven crossed the distance to stand beside her, his breath pluming in the cool morning air. "They trust you," he said quietly, voice rough with emotion he fought to mask. "In places I never could." Myron's smile was brief, but illuminated the bleak quarters like a flare. "They need someone who sees them." He closed his eyes, the weight of all he lost pressing into his chest. A kingdom in decay, allies turned foes, and now the fragile alliance with the woman who carried the blood of his greatest enemy. Yet there was something in her presence, something fierce and steady, that anchored him in the storm of solitude. "I want them to see me like they see you," he confessed, voice raw, "to trust me not as a king, but as someone who," he faltered, "someone who will not fail them." Her amber eyes softened, deeper, now, with the promise of an unspoken truce. "Trust is a bloom that grows slow and stubborn. You're learning to water the soil." The beast's growl softened in response, a deep rumble beneath the earth, and Riven's hand found hers, fingers tangling with quiet urgency. In that shared breath, between wolves left behind and a man learning to yield his iron grip, a new chapter whispered into being, not one of crowns or conquest, but of healing, of hard-won trust, and the fragile hope cradled in the heart of the lost. They stood among the shadows and the scorned, two souls etched with scars and secrets, slowly threading their wills together against the darkening horizon. Outside the walls, threats waited, whispers of treachery and the cruel weight of heritage. Inside, the slow dance of trust began, fragile as the dawn, fierce as the wolf's cry at the edge of night. The past would not rest. Neither would they. But here, in the circle of outcasts and the silent kingdom of their shared shadows, something began, a fire kindled, not by blood or power, but by the sheer, defiant will to endure. The heavy doors of the council chamber groaned open, their protest swallowed quickly by the tense hush that had fallen over the gathered court. Riven's eyes flicked toward the new arrival, a man stepping through the shadows like a poison-laced promise. His clothes were finely wrought, too fine for these broken walls. His smile was practiced, sharp at the edges. The man's bearing was that of a royal emissary, but every inch of him whispered deceit. "I come bearing words for King Riven and his court," the man announced, voice smooth as silk twisted around a blade. "From the Eastern Throner, proposal of peace. 50 treaty to end this bloodline's war, before it consumes what little remains of this realm." The court murmured unease, rippling like a cold wind through the gathered nobles, the outcasts, the whisperers holding their breath for what would come next. Myron stood at Riven's side, her gaze steady, unflinching, amid this fragile hope. Her presence was a rock, a silent declaration that she would not be swept away by lies. "Peace," Riven's voice was flat, hard as obsidian. "Speak plainly. What terms do you offer that might unburden our wounds?" The emissary's smile widened, teeth bared, so deliberately careful, it seemed rehearsed. "A simple proposition. Your daughter's curse of this fatal taint. Said to doom her line is your true torment. Sever ties with the woman for whom your people's faith now wavers. Leave her to exile. Restore your court's honor. Let the shadow that clings to her pass away with her." Myron's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the hilt of her dagger at her side. The poison was thick, but her calm did not waver. The court shifted uneasily, some faces tightening with unease, others splintering with doubt. Whispered words sparked like kindling, doubt-biting roots, spreading fractures in silent cracks beneath Riven's throne. The beast beneath Riven's skin stirred his growl, a rumble that clawed from deep inside his chest. It was low at first, a warning, not just to the court, but a fierce defense of Mienne, of their fragile bond. It flowed beneath the surface, invisible to all but her and Riven himself. His steel-grey eyes flamed as he raised a hand, palm open as if to halt the fracture before it could grow beyond control. "Enough!" Riven commanded, voice ringing and cracked with iron and fire. "We will not be swayed by whispers forged from hatred and fear." Yet the court was divided. Some turned their gaze on Miren with thinly veiled suspicion, while others glanced to Riven, questioning how long his patience could hold. The beast snarled again, louder now, baring teeth of unyielding loyalty, as if willing to rip the traitors clean from the walls if they dared. Yet beneath the fury, a subtle shift unfolded, those wolves closest to Miren, the outcast who had whispered in the shadows about her strength and resolve, now pressed nearer to her side, their allegiance threading itself through the division like a razor-sharp truth. Myron's voice cut through the chaos, clear and steady. "Your peace," she said deliberately, "is built on lies. The curse you speak of is but a myth twisted, weaponized to weaken us from within. You sow doubt where unity belongs. But we are not pawns in your game." The emissary's eyes flickered, irritation sparking beneath his veneer of politeness. "And what would you have us believe, then? That you come bearing the truth? That you alone hold the key to breaking this ancient doom?" "I hold more than truth. I hold proof," she said, drawing from within the folds of her cloak a worn scroll, its edges singed and stained by time. The parchment held secrets long hidden, evidence of deceit spun by enemies who thrived on our ruin. She let the scroll catch the light, a silent weapon of revelation. The curse was fabricated by those who once sought to divide these lands, to sever our lineages and claim the throne through treachery. It is not fate that threatens us. It is betrayal. The court's murmurs shifted again, the tide turning beneath their feet. More voices now spoke in cautious favor, a recalibration of fear into defiance. Riven's hand came down hard upon the armrest of his throne, knuckles white, as he felt the thread of truth weave itself between them. His beast settled, a growl now, more a steady purr of satisfaction. His gaze met Myren's, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, a silent promise that neither shadow nor poison would tear them apart. As the emissary's smirk faded into thin, sour bitterness, he bowed curtly. "We shall see, if that lie holds as well as you claim," and with a final glance that lingered like a cold knife between them, he retreated back into the shadows from whence he came. The chamber remained heavy with tension long after his departure, but the fracture, once threatening to break their fragile unity, had been held at bay. The court, fractured but not shattered, looked to Riven and Myren, to the king and the woman who sat in his shadow, as the axis upon which their battered world might yet turn toward dawn. That night, beneath the cold glare of a wide, star-studded sky, Mien sat alone at the edge of the pack's hidden sanctuary. The fire before her spat sparks that drifted upward like scattered dreams. The youngest wolves, still learning the language of the wild, crouched close. Their eyes bright, faces anxious and curious, they had gathered around her, as if drawn to some ancient cadence woven into her breath. The scars at her cheekbone caught the flickering light, a faint shadow beneath the amber glow that mirrored the fierce pulse beating within. She sang softly, a melody, born not of royal courts or whispered betrayals, but of something older, something deeper. It flowed like water over stone, a lullaby knitted from memory and hope. The song spoke of survival, of secrets unearthed, and the slow unraveling of the curse that had shadowed her bloodline like a dark cloud. Her voice carried the weight of every sacrifice, every step taken through fire and cold, but also the unyielding courage to stand, not just survive, but to claim her own destiny beneath the indifferent stars. Riven watched from the darkness beyond the firelight, unseen, unwilling yet unable to tear himself away. Her song reached inside the fortress of his pride, unlocking the quiet places he had denied even to himself. The king, the beast, the man who had ruled with iron and frost, now trembled on the edge of something raw and fragile, a need deeper than power, fiercer than command. He swallowed the rising ache, the silent plea in his chest, that whispered for her to know exactly how much he needed her presence, not just as his shadow, but as the fierce flame that might one day burn away all the darkness. The night folded around them, a vast silence stretched between the walls of pain and hope, of scars etched in skin and soul. The stars above bore witness to a truth neither man nor wolf dared voice aloud, not yet, but it was there. And beneath that impossible endless sky, the fire kindled again, slow and steady, defiant against the night. The fire's glow flickered low in the great hall, casting undulating shadows along the stone walls, lined with worn tapestries and banners faded by time. For the first time since Myron's arrival, the heavy silence between them was replaced by an invitation that felt like a fissure in a glacier, raw and irrevocable. Riven's voice was low, roughened by years of command, but fragile in its rare openness. "Sit with me." The words slipped from his lips, as more than mere necessity. To those who heard, it was an unspoken challenge, a shaking of foundations no one thought possible. His broad shoulders, usually squared and unyielding, bent slightly toward her as the court watched with bated breath. Myron's eyes caught the firelight, reflecting flashes of amber and something harder to grasp, hope, perhaps, or a carefully guarded longing. Without hesitation, she accepted. Her steady footsteps carried her forward, the scar on her cheek catching the light, like a whispered testament to battles survived. She seated herself, not as a subject, but as an equal, at a small table beside his own seat of power. The court's murmur rippled like wind through dry leaves, shock bleeding into curiosity and cautious speculation. To dine at the king's side was no small gesture. It was an acknowledgement that cracked through the brittle veneer of court politics and ancient grudges. A partnership was being born quietly, defiantly, beneath the eyes that once sought to see her fall. Riven's beast, always lurking at his heel like a shadow made flesh, settled just beyond the fire's reach. The creature's breath steamed in the cool air, muscles taut and ready, a sentinel, not just of territory, but of the fragile alliance taking root before darkness dared approach. Its gaze was fierce but watchful, as if guarding something more precious than the crown itself. She reached for the coarse bread laid before her, fingers brushing against the rough-hewn edge. The simplicity of the actor-shared meal felt monumental. Beneath the weight of the room's scrutiny, under the flicker of firelight and the silent watchfulness of the beast, something shifted in the space between them. The spark was fragile, uncertain, but undeniably there. Riven's steel-grey eyes met hers briefly, not with command, but with acknowledgement, a tacit admission that the cold king could thaw where it mattered most. In that glance, Myron sensed the slow shift in the currents beneath their shared history, a tide beginning to turn towards something uncharted. "Tell me," he said, voice hoarse but steady, "what do you see when you look at this place?" "At me?" Myron's gaze didn't falter. "I see a kingdom on the edge of collapse and a man who carries its weight like a chain around his neck. But I also see something buried beneath that armor, something fierce." His jaw tightened, pride and vulnerability tangled in the silence that stretched between them. Words failed him for, once. His fortress cracked enough to let something real slip through. The fire sputtered, sending a gust of warm air flickering over their skin, and for a moment, the walls around them, the judgment, the history, the accusations seemed to dissolve, leaving only the fragile promise of a new accord. Outside, the night deepened, the stars distant but watchful. The beast shifted, curling closer, as if sensing its master's openness carried risk as well as hope. Before the court could absorb the seismic shift, a rumble shattered the tentative peace. The distant cry of horns wound through the night air, sharp and furious, a herald of war pounding against the fragile accords freshly forged in firelight. From the dark horizon, a rival Alpha approached swiftly, his forces like a storm, battering the kingdom's borders. The assault was sudden, feral, and commanding, with the hardened rush of desperate men and beasts alike pulling at the edges of the fragile peace. The hall erupted into tense chaos, guards scrambling, weapons drawn, voices raised in urgent commands. Riven rose with a wolfish snarl, his commanding presence igniting a rallying fire within the defenders. The beast flared its hackles in echo, fangs bared in a vow of ferocity and protection. But it was Myron who moved toward the fray with a calm, born of unyielding strength, not with weapons drawn, but with an aura that seemed to pulse with something deeper. She stepped aside to the compound's edge, where the wild pack circled, restless and tense. The rivals' wolves lunged like knives in the moonlight, but there was an unseen thread woven through the chaosan, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated from Myron's core to the beasts surrounding her. Her hand brushed along the sleek fur of a snarling wolf beside her, and with a glance the beast's growl softened, muscles slowing, threatening teeth retracting. It was not domination or control, but connection, an unspoken language acknowledged in the glimmer of her steady gaze and the quiet strength that radiated from her very being. Riven watched, his steel eyes narrowing as a puzzling surge of awe coiled in his chest. This was power unlike any he had known, not forceful, but binding, elegant, and fierce in its gentleness. "Be ready," he barked, voice molten with rage that demanded loyalty, not just of men, but of hearts bound to the kingdom's survival. Yet beneath the fury, something softer flickered, pride burning fierce and unguarded. The rival Alpha pressed forward, brutal and unyielding, but the united pack, humans and beasts intertwined, held ground with a strength that was both raw and resolute. Myron's influence flowed like the tide, quiet but inevitable, weaving through the snarls and snap of teeth. The beasts responded, not as weapons, but as extensions of wills, joined by something older and truer than carnage. Riven found himself at her side, their movements a mirror in the chaos. In the blur of motion and blood and whispered commands, his rage softened into resolve. She was no shadow in his reign. She was the claim he didn't yet know he'd been allowed to make. A power born from the ancient bond between woman and beast, king and queen of an emerging dominion forged beyond fear. Together, they pushed the intruders back, marking the boundary of a new alliance, one that was neither weakness nor fragile truce, but an unbreakable connection welded in fire and blood and the beating heart of wolves united. When the last echoes of battle faded into the cold morning mist, Riven lowered his sword, breath ragged, eyes fixed on Myron, whose steady gaze held both the light of dawn and the fierce defiance of the wild. "You are not just the shadow at my side," he said, voice hushed but fierce. "You are my strength. My fire, the storm they will remember." Myron allowed herself the barest smile, worn but genuine, the first fissure of trust that softened the jagged edges of their shared scars. "I stand with you," she replied simply, "not as your shadow, but as your equal, as your partner, as the beast who will fight beside you, not behind." The great hall, threaded with the scent of smoke and sweat and iron, bore witness to the fragile birth of something fierce and unstoppable. Where once was isolation, now burned an alliance tempered in survival and forged from the ancient rhythms of blood and heart. The wolf at Riven's side dipped its head once, an unspoken benediction to a new dawn. The king of the Alpha Pack had finally let go of the cold, a king for whom power alone was never enough. For the first time, he and the woman who defied his shadow stepped forward, not as ruler and outcast, but as the fiercest force the kingdom had ever known. Together, they would reclaim their fate beneath the same unyielding stars. The great hall, still heavy with the scents of iron and smouldering wood, grew quiet after the last tremors of battle had passed. Dust settled on shattered banners, blood dried on cold stone, and the murmurs of the pack filtered through the corridors like a cautious breeze stirring old ghosts. Myron knelt beside Riven, whose broad shoulders sagged beneath the weight of both physical pain and a wounded pride that ran deeper than any blade could reach. The jagged birthmark above his right eyebrow was marred now by fresh bruises, and the cold in his steel-grey eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. She reached out, fingers steady but gentle, tracing the lines of torn cloth and the cruel abrasions that traced his skin. "You fought like a storm," she whispered, voice low enough that no one beyond the walls could hear, caught somewhere between stubborn defiance and a flicker of acceptance. For all his fury and iron will, the man was undeniably human beneath the armor he wore like a second skin. "I am no storm," he said quietly. "I am the mountain." Unyielding, Miriam let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and with a tenderness that surprised them both, she pressed a damp cloth to the split cut on his cheekbone. Even mountains crack. Her thumb brushed lightly over the faint scar that marked her own skin, a silent recognition passing between them. Both bore marks, not just of battle, but of survival, of scars carved by betrayal, exile, and defiance. In that quiet chamber, beneath the weight of the world pressing close, the distance between them softened. Words were unnecessary. Their shared silence was a kind of covenant, a fragile bridge built over the shattered ground of their pasts. She tended to his wounds as if she were stitching their fractured trust back together, stitch by stitch, each touch a whispered promise that they would stand through whatever came next. Outside, hushed voices rippled through the court, whispers painted in awe and cautious hope. The exile who had returned with nothing but fire and a fierce will was spoken of not as a threat, but as a queen ascending from the ashes. Mian could feel the weight of eyes upon her, the shifting of old alliances, uncertainty mingling with a fragile respect. The kingdom's heart was stirring, and in that movement was a subtle acknowledgement. Something had changed. The quiet did not last. Shadows curled in the corners of the court where loyalty was no more than a veneer stretched thin. The betrayal came sudden and sharp, a whispered alliance between those who swore fealty but harbored venom beneath smiles. A trusted hand in Riven's council, cloaked in the guise of kinship, sought to claim the throne by sabotaging the fragile peace, and their blow came close enough to shatter everything it touched. The trap was laid beneath the guise of a council meeting, words laced with poisoned promises and veiled threats. A festering coalition hoped to exploit the cracks between the Alpha King and the woman who had shaken his foundations. Rumors twisted through the great hall like a snake in the grass, spreading discord where only unity could hold fast. But Miriam was ready. Her mind, honed sharp by years of exile and battle, caught the subtle inconsistencies. A phrase too practiced, a glance too calculated. She met Riven's gaze across the room, silent urgency sparking between them. The king's beast, sleek and shadowed, rose to her side, a living symbol of the bond they shared and the pack's unyielding loyalty. In an instant that stretched and cracked the world between silence and violence, Mian stepped into the center of the storm. With calm authority, she challenged the traitor before the court, unraveling the deceit thread by thread. Her voice did not waver as she laid bare the conspiracy, the truth cutting so cleanly it left no room for retreat or denial. "Your loyalty is not to this kingdom," she said, eyes burning with unrelenting fire, "but to selfish ambition that will drown us all in darkness." The pack, roused by her conviction and the unshakable trust in her, rallied behind her as one fierce, unbroken. When Riven finally rose to his feet beside her, the cold armor of his kingship was softened, replaced by something more real and resolute. The beast at his side pressed closer to Miriam, resting its head near her feet, the unquestioning protector, sealing her place not as an outsider, but as the very heart of the kingdom's future. Betrayal had struck hard, but trust, once fractured, was rebuilt stronger through the fires of truth and loyalty. Together they faced the darkness, the woman who had dared to defy an Alpha King, the king who had learned to bend, not break when the storm had passed and the court lay quiet once more. The two of them found a rare moment of peace beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oaks that had watched over the kingdom for centuries. The soft rustle of leaves whispered timeless secrets as they sat side by side on the moss-lined earth, far from the sharp edges of power and suspicion. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant rain. The world hushed as if holding its breath for the quiet bond that had blossomed between them. No words were needed. Their shared destiny settled around them like a mantle, steady and sure, heavier than any crown, but lighter than any burden when borne together. Riven's hand found hers, neither seeking nor offering, but simply allowing the connection to flow, that silent acknowledgement of shared scars, shared battles, and a future built on trust, forged in fire and shadow. His beast, the living embodiment of his power and soul, lowered its great head gently onto Mirren's lap, warm and steady. The pack's guardian, silent and watchful, folded into this circle of quiet strength.